The Holloway record 1834, a stillness, thicker than air, hung over the swamps and red clay fields of southern Georgia. The year was 1834. The Holloway estate sat along the edge of Turkey Creek, its walls of plaster and pine already cracked by dampness, its land swollen with secrets. A plantation that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet whispered about by neighbors who passed too quickly on horseback, refusing to look toward its porch when the sun went down. There were stories, of course. They always begin as stories. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Holloways were not the richest family in Montgomery County, nor the most powerful. Their cotton fields produced enough to sustain them, but not enough to rival the Carters or the Thompsons upriver. What made them remarkable was not their fortune, but their strangeness. Their matriarch, Eliza Holloway, had an intensity to her gaze that seemed to pull the breath from the room. Her hair, always pinned too tightly, revealed the sharpness of her skull. Servants whispered that she prayed in the smokehouse instead of the chapel, and that the black ribbon tied around her wrist was never once removed, not even at night. When her husband, Nathaniel Holloway, died of a sudden fever in early 1834, the estate shifted. His will placed Eliza as sole guardian of their 3 children, Thomas 17, Andrew 15, and Sarah 11. By law, Nathaniel's brother, Joseph Holloway, could have contested, but Joseph had already vanished westward with debts pressing against his heels. And so the land, the people, and the house itself fell entirely into Eliza's hands. At first, there was nothing openly amiss. The household carried on, and neighbors made the usual calls of sympathy. But by midsummer, the atmosphere on the property had changed. The fields were worked in silence. No hymns rose from the slave cabins at dusk. Even the livestock grew gaunt, though no sickness could be found. One night in July, a rider from Glenwood claimed he heard a woman's voice carrying across the creek long after midnight. It was not a hymn, nor a prayer. It was a low, guttural chant, broken by pauses as if someone were counting or reciting a passage by memory. He did not stop to listen closer. He turned his horse and rode until his lungs burned. In early August, the Holloway children ceased attending the small schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. The teacher, Mrs. Calloway, sent a letter of concern. Eliza never answered. Rumors began to circle among the neighbors. Some said Eliza had taken ill. Others said she had become consumed with grief. But then, in September, a letter surfaced. It was addressed to a man in Savannah, known only as Dr. Albrecht Fenwick, a physician of questionable reputation. The letter, preserved in the Montgomery County court files decades later, read in Eliza's hand, "The body yields its secret slowly. My observations suggest that the inheritance of constitution may be broken down, examined, and rebuilt stronger. I have 3 subjects at present, 2 approaching maturity, 1 still pliable. Their features must be corrected, their lineage purified. The church will not understand. You will. The handwriting is unmistakable, tight, deliberate strokes that cut through the paper like the edge of a knife." The enslaved workers of the Holloway plantation would later testify, under duress and with trembling voices, that beginning in late summer, Eliza held gatherings in the parlor at night. She brought her children down from their rooms, one by one, and stood them before the great oak table. Upon it lay a book. Not the family Bible, but a thick volume bound in leather, its edges stained dark as though with wine. Eliza would place her hand on each child's head, speaking words none of the witnesses could understand. When asked in later years what the children looked like during these gatherings, one elderly witness, Esther, answered, "Their eyes were open, but they did not seem awake. The boy Thomas, he was stiff as a board, like a soldier on parade. The little girl Sarah, she cried without sound, her mouth moving but no voice, and the middle one, Andrew, he laughed, though nothing was funny. It was the kind of laugh that makes the hair on your arms stand up." By October, the Holloway property was avoided altogether. Local merchants reported that Eliza stopped buying flour and cornmeal, instead requesting peculiar items, salts, mercury, and laudanum. When asked the purpose, she smiled and said it was for preservation. On the night of October 21st, the Holloway's nearest neighbor, Henry Parrish, was woken by a glow in the direction of Turkey Creek. He swore under oath years later that it was not firelight, but something stranger, white and steady, rising from the roofline as if the house itself were exhaling light. He watched for nearly an hour before it sank back into darkness. The children were seen less and less. When the family did appear in public, once at the courthouse in Mount Vernon, the change in their appearance startled even casual acquaintances. Thomas, once a broad-shouldered boy, had grown gaunt, with shadows beneath his eyes like bruises. Andrew's hair had thinned in patches, though he was barely 15, and Sarah, in her white dress, clung to her mother's sleeve with both hands, her skin pale as chalk. Neighbors whispered that Eliza was remaking her children, bone by bone. By the year's end, 3 men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Jonah, were reported missing from the Holloway fields. They were enslaved laborers, each in the prime of life, each described as strong and healthy. Eliza told the overseer they had run away. No search was organized, but in the spring thaw of 1835, fragments were found in the ash pit behind the smokehouse. Teeth, unmistakably human, blackened by fire but still embedded in jawbone. Sheriff J. P. Rowlands, then a young deputy, recalled in his later journal, "I had seen the dead before, but this was different. The bones were not broken as by violence. They were sawn, cut straight like timber. Someone had been making a study." He ordered the fragments buried without record, not wishing to invite scandal. The Holloway house remains on record as structurally sound but abandoned by 1840. No family lived there for more than a season. Children who wandered too close spoke of hearing a woman's voice reciting names in the dark, and even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the creek still carries whispers on windless nights. But all of that, what came after, rests on the beginning in 1834, when Eliza Holloway first set her children before the oak table and opened her book. The Holloway record 1835. By the first months of 1835, Eliza Holloway's routines had hardened into ritual. The neighbors spoke of light in her windows at all hours, and though few dared approach, those who did described the same eerie sound, voices reciting in unison, low and measured, as though the household had become a kind of private chapel. But there were no psalms, no hymns. The rhythm was too slow, too deliberate, and always at the center was Eliza. She had taken to wearing a long black dress tied with the same ribbon around her wrist, the knot never once loosened. Her hair grew brittle, her cheekbones more prominent, but her eyes only sharpened. The overseer claimed she could quiet a room of 30 men with a single look. "She doesn't speak like a mistress anymore," he remarked, "but like a physician delivering instructions." The Holloway children bore the changes most visibly. Thomas, the eldest, had grown skeletal, his face hollowed, his skin stretched taut across his jaw. Those who caught glimpses of him said he walked stiffly, as if his joints had been splintered and crudely reassembled. His hands twitched without command, fingers curling and flexing in strange spasms. Andrew, 15, was altered in another way. His laughter no longer matched the circumstances. He would giggle at the sight of rain, bark out guffaws when a plate shattered, and murmur jokes to himself that no one could understand. At times he seemed to mimic his mother's words half a beat too late, as though her voice had imprinted directly onto his. Sarah, the youngest, changed most subtly. She no longer spoke at all in public. Instead, she mouthed silent words, her lips forming syllables no ear could hear. Some swore they saw her whispering in time with the crows on the fence posts, her eyes following their movements with unblinking precision. What made these transformations unbearable for those in the household was not merely the children's strangeness, but Eliza's pride in it. On January 14th, 1835, one of the enslaved women, Esther, the same who later testified, was ordered to scrub the parlor floor. She described finding thin stains, dark and metallic, near the legs of the oak table. When she hesitated, Eliza told her coldly, "Do not fear the signs of correction. They are proof that weakness has been drained away." Esther said she looked to the children for explanation, but Thomas only stared straight ahead, and Andrew laughed, while Sarah pressed her mouth against the ribbon on her mother's wrist. In late February, correspondence between Eliza and Dr. Albrecht Fenwick became more regular. Surviving fragments, recovered decades later in the Holloway attic, reveal the chilling tone: "You must not halt the work now. The strength of constitution is most pliable in the passage from youth to maturity. Intervene too late, and the defects are fixed forever. Your observations confirm my own. Bone, blood, and temper may all be unlearned, then rewritten. Continue, record precisely." Fenwick's reputation was already stained in Savannah. He had been accused of grave robbing from the colonial cemetery, of purchasing corpses from pauper wards, of delivering lectures on the malleability of the nervous system that made even physicians recoil. Yet Eliza quoted him as if he were scripture. Not all in the household obeyed silently. Marcus Hall, a young man of mixed parentage who had been raised among the enslaved but given light duties in the house, grew suspicious. He alone among the staff had been taught letters by Nathaniel Holloway before his death. One night, slipping into the parlor after Eliza retired, Marcus discovered a bundle of papers hidden beneath the oak table. They contained diagrams, outlines of skeletons, crude sketches of skulls with elongated jaws and widened eye sockets. Notes in Eliza's hand referred to selective pairing, purging weakness, and the neutralization of the inferior stock. Across one margin, scrawled in red ink, was the phrase, "Thomas will become more than human, Andrew too unstable, Sarah the true vessel." Marcus later confessed to another servant that he could not sleep after reading those words. He feared what Eliza intended and more. He feared what she had already begun. By March, Eliza's requests to merchants had grown stranger still. One shopkeeper recorded a list she dictated: chalk powder, a saw with a silver edge, arsenic, and a quantity of saltpeter. When he hesitated, she said calmly, "I am preserving the future." Suspicion among the neighbors deepened. Mrs. Calloway, the schoolteacher, rode once more to inquire after the children. She returned pale, refusing to speak of what she had seen. All she said weeks later was, "They stood too close, too still." The girl's lips moved, but Eliza was speaking. It was as if one voice lived in four bodies. By midsummer, 3 of the strongest field hands, Isaiah, Caleb, and Jonah, had grown visibly ill. Each displayed the same condition: weakness in the limbs, sores at the mouth, and a wasting pallor that worsened by the day. When Marcus confronted Eliza, she silenced him with a glance. But whispers circulated that the men had been summoned at night into the parlor, then sent back to their cabins trembling and unsteady. Within weeks, all 3 had vanished. The official account listed them as runaways, but the smokehouse told another story. One evening in August, Margaret, a neighboring planter's wife who had long distrusted Eliza, sent a desperate letter to Dr. Fenwick's former rival, a physician named Jonathan Petton in Savannah. She wrote, "Something unnatural is being practiced at the Holloway estate. I do not claim witchcraft. I am not foolish, but her experiments have left men broken, and the children are no longer themselves. If this continues, I fear not only for them, but for us all. Please, if there is any recourse, guide me." Petton, already skeptical of Fenwick's methods, rode north weeks later to witness the Holloway children firsthand. In his medical journal, preserved at the Georgia Historical Society, he recorded, "They present as pale, malnourished, and yet overstimulated of the nervous system. The eldest boy's bones seem to lengthen without proportion. The second boy is afflicted with manic fits, his laughter excessive and inappropriate. The girl is silent, her lips moving in patterns I cannot reproduce. I suspect chemical interference, though of what kind I cannot yet discern. I advise immediate intervention." But no intervention came. Montgomery County officials, already wary of scandal, chose to remain distant. Dr. Fenwick's influence in Savannah cast too long a shadow, and Eliza's wealth insulated her from inquiry. And so, the Holloway parlor remained lit at midnight, the oak table heavy with stains no scrubbing could erase, while the sound of voices, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes more than 4, rose and fell across the swamp. The records that survive suggest that 1835 was not the year of conclusion, but of escalation. What began with Nathaniel's death had transformed into something far larger, rooted in doctrine, secrecy, and blood. And it was only a matter of time before the boundary between ritual and atrocity was fully crossed. The Holloway record 1836. By the beginning of 1836, Eliza Holloway's fixation had hardened into something beyond grief or eccentricity. The household no longer resembled a plantation but a chamber of observation where even the smallest gesture was measured, recorded, and corrected. The oak table remained at the center of all things. It was said that she wiped it with salt and vinegar each dawn, then covered it in fresh cloth. Beneath that cloth she placed instruments, calipers, weights, small vials of powder, a brass compass for tracing circles. The enslaved who cleaned the room whispered that the table was never without stains, though each morning it was scrubbed until the wood seemed ready to splinter. And upon that table, week after week, she set her children. Thomas, now 18, appeared scarcely older than a boy of 14. His shoulders curved inward as though his spine resisted its natural growth. When neighbors glimpsed him, they remarked on the unevenness of his face, one cheek protruding, the other sunken, as if bone itself were shifting. Andrew, 16, was volatile. His laughter turned violent, breaking suddenly into sobs or into mimicry of Eliza's commands. More than once, servants swore they heard two voices in the parlor, Eliza's and Andrew's, speaking the same words in the same rhythm, yet not perfectly aligned, a grotesque echo. Sarah, 12, frightened them most. She no longer cried. She moved quietly through rooms, her lips always forming silent words. One maid reported that when she dropped a bowl, Sarah turned her head slowly and mouthed the word break, a moment before the porcelain shattered against the floor. The enslaved men assigned to work within the house, Isaiah, Caleb, Jonah, had already disappeared. Their cabins stood empty. By spring, 3 more were summoned into the parlor and returned altered, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling, voices stammering. They did not last long. Within weeks they too were gone. Marcus Hall, still employed within the household, could no longer keep silent. One night, while clearing the parlor, he found letters bound with twine beneath the oak table. They were written in Eliza's hand but addressed to Fenwick in Savannah. With trembling fingers, Marcus slipped several into his shirt and hid them in his quarters. The contents confirmed the worst. The subjects cannot withstand prolonged correction, their constitutions collapse, but the children, oh, the children bend and yield, their marrow accepts the lesson. I see it in their eyes when I recite, they are vessels. Soon their defects will be erased, and from them a line unbroken by weakness will begin. Another page marked with streaks of ink noted, Thomas, skeletal elongation progressing. Andrew, unstable, must be guided by constant mimicry. Sarah, perfection of silence, ideal receptacle. Continue regimen of mercury and salt. If collapse occurs, begin again. Marcus confessed years later that he nearly burned the letters at once, fearing to be found with them. Yet some instinct told him they were proof that one day someone outside the Holloway walls would need to see what Eliza had done. In March, Margaret Parrish, neighbor and long-time skeptic of Eliza's practices, wrote again. This time her letter was addressed not to Fenwick but to Dr. Jonathan Petton, Fenwick's rival. Dr. Petton, I implore you. I have no standing to interfere, yet what I have seen will not allow me to sleep. The Holloway children waste away, their bodies stretched and twisted by some regimen their mother claims as improvement. Strong men disappear, and the swamp itself seems to shudder with the sounds of that house at night. I beg you, if any authority remains, act before nothing human is left of them. Petton, alarmed, agreed to travel once more. He entered the Holloway house under pretense of offering condolences for Nathaniel's death anniversary. What he observed confirmed Margaret's fears. In his medical journal, Petton described the scene. The matron received me coldly, her manner clipped and without softness. She spoke of her children as subjects and gestured toward them as though they were specimens in a cabinet. The eldest, Thomas, appears severely deformed, shoulders uneven, bones of the face asymmetrical, teeth yellowing though gums remain intact. The second, Andrew, is afflicted with uncontrollable mirth, alternating with fits of mimicry, repeating his mother's words as if compelled. The youngest, Sarah, makes no sound but mouths continuous syllables, her gaze unbroken. I fear chemical manipulation of the blood or marrow. Such alterations cannot be natural. Petton attempted to warn Eliza that her children were in mortal danger. Her reply was recorded word for word in his notes. You see weakness where I see correction. They are being remade. If they suffer, it is the breaking of old chains. One day the defect of our line will be gone, and the Holloways will stand beyond decay. By midsummer, Petton had gathered testimony from Margaret, Marcus, and 2 surviving servants. He presented his concerns before a magistrate in Mount Vernon, but the officials hesitated. To accuse a woman of Eliza's standing meant scandal. To suggest experiments upon her own children bordered on blasphemy. Meanwhile, Eliza's connection to Fenwick only deepened. A letter dated July 2nd bore his signature. The vessel is nearly prepared. You must not falter. The world resists those who correct its errors, but history rewards them. Ignore the cries of weak men. What you do is not cruelty. It is improvement. The Holloway parlor had by then become infamous among the enslaved community. Some swore that shadows gathered there even when no lamps were lit, moving like figures across the wall. Others claimed to hear Sarah whispering their names in her soundless voice, lips shaping the syllables of those soon to vanish. Marcus, more terrified than ever, smuggled additional letters out of the house. He confided to Esther that he meant to send them north, where Fenwick's reputation might not protect Eliza. But before he could, a new horror overtook them. In August, a storm split the oak beside the parlor. For 3 nights after, the household reported lights flickering in the rafters, even with candles unlit. Andrew fell into violent spasms, his laughter turning to screams. Thomas wandered the halls in the dark, muttering about bones growing inside his skull. And Sarah was seen standing beneath the broken oak, her lips forming words no one dared approach close enough to hear. The year ended with fear coiled tight around Turkey Creek. Neighbors whispered that law could no longer contain what had begun. Margaret feared for her own children. Marcus feared discovery, each night sleeping with the letters hidden beneath his mat. Petton, for all his testimony, feared he was too late, and Eliza Holloway, she seemed untouchable. Her voice carried through the parlor, unbroken, unwavering, while her children wasted before her eyes. The Holloway record 1837-1890, the storm that split the oak in 1836, marked the beginning of Eliza Holloway's downfall. By the following spring, whispers of her practices had grown too loud to ignore. Physicians from Savannah were summoned, ostensibly to review her treatments, but in truth to examine her state of mind. They found a woman who spoke with precision and fervor, her notes in perfect order, her reasoning framed as science. Yet beneath the polish, the obsession was plain. When pressed on the vanished men, she claimed they had been absorbed into correction. When asked about her children's suffering, she dismissed it as the old weakness leaving their flesh. The panel's verdict was unanimous. Eliza Holloway was not fit to oversee her estate or her children. They declared her mind compromised by delusional disorder. In September of 1837, her sister-in-law Catherine Vance arrived from Charleston with staff of her own. Catherine assumed guardianship of the children and the property. Her first act was to have Eliza confined to an upper chamber in the Holloway house, a prisoner in her own rooms. She ordered the Creek rituals halted. She dismissed Fenwick's name from all conversation. She attempted to bring Thomas, Andrew, and Sarah back to health. Yet Dr. Petton warned that their bodies and minds bore damage too deep to be undone. Thomas's bones ached constantly. Andrew drifted between mirth and incoherence. Sarah remained silent, lips moving in endless shapes of soundless speech. Catherine hired nurses to tend them, though some fled within days, unable to bear the children's vacant gazes. Eliza, confined, accepted her captivity with eerie calm. "He has won," she muttered, though no one could say who she meant. Her journals, seized by Catherine, revealed only fragments, diagrams of marrow, tables of weights, calculations of transfer. Catherine pressed for answers. Investigators traced Fenwick to Charleston, only to find his office abandoned, debts unpaid, letters half burned. Among the remnants were correspondences with Eliza, and more troubling still, communications with a Howard Pritchard, attorney for the Delacroix family. The letters revealed a conspiracy. Pritchard had waited for Eliza's collapse, anticipating her removal so he might seize Holloway lands as guardian. He had fed Fenwick funds and information, nurturing Eliza's spiral until the outcome was inevitable. When the evidence reached court, Pritchard was disbarred. He fled Burke County before charges could be brought. The Delacroix, who had stood by Eliza as patrons, denied knowledge. Yet Marcus Hall testified against them, his words carrying the weight of first-hand witness. Still, the deeper truth of Nathaniel Holloway's household emerged slowly, like bones rising from shallow earth. Records showed Nathaniel had likely been sterile, afflicted with the same weakness Eliza raged against. But rather than accept barrenness, he had fathered children with enslaved women long before his marriage. Those children, grown to skillful workers, lived at Holloway Estate as favored servants. Isaiah, Caleb, Jonah, they were not strangers. They were Nathaniel's sons, half, brothers to Thomas, Andrew, and Sarah. Eliza's suspicions, though distorted by grief and paranoia, had touched reality. Her children's resemblance to enslaved men was not delusion. It was blood, but her conclusions, that they were brought to her bed, that Fenwick's rituals could erase the flaw-twisted partial truth into atrocity. She became executioner where she had once been victim. In September of 1838, Caleb collapsed and died, his body poisoned by mercury and salt. Jonah lingered in cognitive ruin until 1846, a living ghost on the property. Isaiah vanished entirely. His kin whispered that he had been buried in silence along the creek. Georgia law did not name such killings murder. Property destroyed was not equal to life taken. Catherine Vance silenced the scandal, arranging Eliza's quiet removal to the asylum at Milledgeville in November 1008. 138. Eliza lived there 14 years. She died in 1852, age 57, of pneumonia. Nurses described her as calm, polite, endlessly writing journals the staff often confiscated. In those pages she never expressed remorse, never admitted fraud, never recanted her belief that weakness had been purged. The Holloway children scattered. Margaret married in Philadelphia, never returning south. Thomas Jr. sold Holloway Estate in 1856, disavowing the land of his birth. The younger children were told softened tales, with horror carefully omitted. Fenwick vanished from record. Rumors placed him in New Orleans or across the Gulf. He left behind only broken patients, ruined estates, and vanished coin. By 1850, his name no longer appeared in any medical directory. The Holloway plantation itself unraveled. Sherman's troops burned the main house in 1864. By 1880, the land was parceled into 6 smaller farms. The name Holloway carried no weight beyond local memory, yet Turkey Creek remained. Its bend grew wild, its waters avoided. Freedmen in the 1870s warned their children that the creek was cursed, tasting blood. By the 1890s, even white farmers skirted the Cypress Bend, unable to say why except that the air was heavy, birds absent, silence deep. One farmer plowing in 1891 unearthed a wooden box, glass bottles crusted with chemical residue, rusted instruments, damp pages covered in smeared script. He buried it again, telling no one but his wife. At his death she burned his diary, saying only, "Some things are meant to stay hidden." The most chilling fragment surfaced in 1899 when Catherine Vance died at 94. Among her trunks, sealed and forgotten, her heirs found a bundle of Eliza's journals. Most were burned unread, deemed too dangerous. But one page, dated March 10, 1838, survived. I have begun the treatments. The 3 subjects respond as expected. At first I felt nothing, but on the 3rd day a stirring as if the marrow of their bodies awoke mine. Doubt whispers. Perhaps it is only delusion, perhaps it is murder. But doubt must be strangled. Faith in the treatment is part of the treatment. I must believe. I cannot stop now. The page passed quietly into archives locked away from the public eye, available only to scholars who petition the Georgia Historical Society. In Burke County, the tale dwindled into folklore. By the 1920s, children heard it only as a ghost story, warning them not to linger by the creek. By 1941, the last living link, Sarah Drummond, niece of Isaiah, died at 106. She remembered her uncle's words before death. Dying is not the worst part. The worst is forgetting who you are while still alive, piece by piece, until nothing remains. With her passing, memory slipped into legend. Documents scattered, letters lost, testimonies dimmed. All that remained was the creek's water, cold and clear, flowing endlessly over roots that remembered. Some say if you stand at the bend on a moonless night, you will hear voices beneath the current. Eliza's, stern and unyielding, Andrew's, laughing and sobbing at once, Sarah's, whispering words without sound. The land forgets nothing, the water remembers, and no matter how many generations pass, the stain of the Holloway record does not wash away. The testimonies of 1837 by early 1837, the Holloway scandal had not yet reached the public record, but fragments of it were being collected. Notes, statements, report, each adding to the slow accretion of horror. It was not the law that pressed first, but medicine. The Georgia Medical Board, alarmed by whispers of Fenwick's marrow theory, dispatched Dr. Elias Morton of Augusta to investigate. Morton was no innovator. He believed firmly in humor's imbalance in the measured practice of bleeding and tonics. He found Fenwick's claims of transfusion without blood laughable, yet dangerous if patients entrusted him with their lives. Morton interviewed staff at Holloway Estate. The cook, Harriet, described the children's weakness. Their hands shake when they lift bread. Their eyes wander, never at rest. A nurse, Ellen Price, told him the children refused broth, claiming it tasted of iron. Andrew, she added, had begun speaking in circles, reciting psalms backward with a grin. Morton wrote in his first report, March 6, 1837, the household presents not the features of natural decline, but of induced malady. The tinctures and draughts administered are not known to me, they bear metallic taint. The mistress insists upon continuance, yet the results are uniform. Degeneration. What Morton did not know then was that Marcus Hall, the overseer, had already stolen a packet of Eliza's letters to Fenwick. Among them were diagrams, childlike sketches of bone marrow, labeled with strange notations, seat of weakness, transfer by ingestion, integrity regained through absorption. Marcus carried these to Dr. William Petton, already wary of Fenwick. Petton compared the handwriting to Eliza's journals and found them identical. Not only her hand, he wrote, but her conviction. She believes herself a pioneer. She records with precision, not delirium. Petton's testimony, preserved in court archives, is chilling in its restraint. I examined 3 men who had been given the drafts enslaved brothers, Isaiah, Caleb, Jonah. All bore tremors, erratic pulse, fevers alternating with chills, the tongue darkened, the teeth loosened. In one, blood seeped beneath the nails until they blackened. These are not the fruits of medicine, but of poison administered with intent. Yet Eliza herself did not think of it as poison. In her journals, what remain of them, she called it purification. One passage, copied by Catherine Vance before the journals were burned, reads, "They do not understand. Weakness is the inheritance of Holloway blood. It creeps through Thomas's bones, through Andrew's fits, through Sarah's silence. I will not watch them sink. I must feed them strength. If it can't..." Be drawn from marrow, dissolved into tincture, then swallowed into their frame, they will be restored. Suffering is the price of salvation. They cry, but their cries mean nothing, for I hear beyond them to the marrow itself, and the marrow speaks, do not relent. Morton, though skeptical, began to fear what he uncovered. He returned in April, this time bringing 2 assistants. They found Andrew bound in bed, wrists bruised from restraint. Sarah stared at the wall, lips moving in endless murmurs. Thomas, older, pleaded with them to take him away. When Morton asked Eliza to explain, she presented her ledger of treatments. Each page bore dates, dosages, outcomes. It was the meticulous record of a physician, except that the physician was a woman with no license, guided by a quack, experimenting upon children and enslaved men alike. Morton later testified she argued her case with such composure that one might believe her sane. She spoke of marrow as if it were the seat of the soul. She claimed she had measured improvement, though I saw only decay. She believed without doubt that she would conquer weakness not by breeding, nor prayer, but by chemistry of her own devising. The law moved slowly, but the estate began to fracture from within. Servants whispered of voices by the creek, of bottles buried in shallow pits. The 3 enslaved brothers grew worse. Caleb's teeth fell out one by one. Jonah wandered at night, muttering Eliza's words as though repeating them kept him alive. Isaiah disappeared for days at a time, only to return, eyes hollow, reeking of stagnant water. Marcus pressed Catherine to act. Catherine hesitated, fearing scandal, but when Thomas himself fell into a seizure that left him near death, she relented. In May of 1837, she summoned the county justices. The depositions collected then form the backbone of what we know. Harriet, the cook, mistress, took the bottles herself at first, then gave them to the children. She said it was for their bones, but they grew worse, not better. I saw her mix powder in their milk, and when they spat it out, she struck them. Andrew's tutor, Mr. Sanderson, the boy once bright in letters now writes backward. He sketches bones upon his slates. When asked where he learned it, he says, "Mother shows me, the marrow sings if you listen." Marcus Hall, I told her it would kill them. She said it was not killing but changing. She said if the children broke, they could be remade. The justices hesitated to call it crime. The enslaved brothers, after all, were property. The children, though suffering, still lived. To accuse a white widow of poisoning her own household was a scandal too vast. Instead, they framed it as mental unsoundness. Eliza was summoned to Augusta for examination. Fenwick, by then vanished, could not be compelled. Eliza resisted. "You call madness what is only courage." She told Morton in her final recorded interview, "You cling to fevers and leeches while I grasp the marrow itself. If I fail as a pioneer, not as a mother." By summer, Caleb was dead. Jonah lingered in half-life. Isaiah, buried secretly at the creek, some said, was gone. Thomas lived, though weakened. Andrew babbled in riddles. Sarah remained silent. Eliza Holloway was confined in September 1837, declared insane, stripped of her household authority. Catherine Vance assumed control. The records, sealed at that time, were meant to close the matter. Yet the fragments survive. Letters, ledgers, journals, depositions, each piece carrying the same chill. A mother's determination hardened into experiment, guided by a fraud, leaving behind wreckage that the law would not name, but that history could not forget. The Holloway record from 1837 remains one of the most disturbing in Burke County's archive. What sets it apart is not only the horror of the acts, but the way they were written down, catalogued, justified, as though cruelty became acceptable once entered into a ledger. That is why the scholars of later decades would call it the Marrow Ledger. Not a tale of madness, but of belief systematized, and belief, once written, does not die, it waits. The Marrow Ledger expands 1837-1838, when Eliza Holloway was confined to her upper chamber in September of 1837. It was thought her work would end with her captivity, yet confinement did not silence her. From her locked room, she continued to write, to calculate, to record. Servants brought her meals, and with each tray she returned scraps of parchment filled with numbers, symbols, and notes. Catherine Vance gathered these scraps and attempted to destroy them. But some, smuggled out by curious servants or preserved by Marcus Hall, survived. They reveal the persistence of Eliza's obsession long after her power had been stripped away. One fragment, dated October 1837, "They say I am broken, but the work continues in marrow whether I sit in chains or not. The body is a ledger, every drop is an entry. If mine cannot write new strength, I will borrow it still. At the same time, Doctor." Elias Morton pressed his inquiry further. He sought corroboration from others who had seen Fenwick's treatments in Charleston. A silversmith recalled supplying him with thin tubes and glass vials. A druggist testified he had sold him mercury, saltpeter, and ground antimony. The quantities, he said, were beyond ordinary prescription. Morton compared these to the chemical traces found in Caleb's body, preserved in hurried notes from Dr. Petton's autopsy. "It is no treatment," Morton concluded, "but a slow dismantling of the flesh, masked as cure." Yet the law would not indict Fenwick. Without his presence, the case remained circumstantial. His absence became his protection. Inside Holloway Estate, Catherine struggled to undo the damage. She fed the children broth, hired tutors, forbade the talk of marrow. But the harm persisted. Thomas's joints cracked when he walked. Andrew alternated between clarity and delirium, once telling his nurse, "Mother said I was a book. She was writing in me. I think she finished." Sarah whispered to herself at night, fragments of words drawn from Eliza's journals. The servants swore they heard her speak Fenwick's name in her sleep. By Christmas of 1837, it was clear the children would never return to ordinary health. Letters from Catherine to her cousin in Charleston survive. One, dated January 3, 1838, "The house is quiet, yet never at rest. The children wander like shades. At night I hear Eliza pacing above us. She speaks aloud, though none answer. Sometimes she calls the children's names, sometimes the names of the enslaved men, as if all were one. I pray each day for release, yet release does not come." In March of 1838, Catherine reported to the county justices that Jonah had died, his body wasted beyond repair. She requested that Eliza be removed entirely from the estate. It was then that the panel ordered her transfer to Milledgeville Asylum. Before her removal, one final examination was carried out by Dr. Petton. His notes, preserved in the Burke County Archive, remain among the most haunting medical testimonies of the 19th century. The subject, Eliza Holloway, speaks without hesitation. She recounts her methods as though they were doctrine, not delusion. She insists that marrow is not only the secret of vitality, but transmissible by preparation. She likens the body to a field. If one stalk grows weak, another may be cut and grafted. She acknowledges the suffering inflicted, but reframes it as necessity. She shows no shame, no hesitation. Her composure is absolute. Petton concluded, "This is not a woman raving. This is a mind sharpened to one purpose, devoid of pity, mistaking cruelty for science." Eliza's final journals before departure are the most disturbing of all. Though many were burned, Catherine's copies reveal her enduring conviction: if marrow can be transferred, then so can memory. If memory can be transferred, then death is no longer master. I have not failed, I have only begun. They fear me now, but in years to come they will see I was right. Work will outlive me. Those words became prophecy of a kind. Though Eliza was carried away in May 1838, the stain of her work lingered. After her confinement, the Holloway estate descended further. The enslaved community, diminished by the loss of Isaiah, Caleb, and Jonah, carried the memory of what had been done to them as a wound that did not heal. Oral testimony collected in the 1870s records their bitterness. "She made us drink what was not water. She said it would make us stronger, but it burned inside. It took away sleep. It made the bones cry." Among white families, the scandal became a hushed tale. Neighbors spoke of the Holloway weakness, but rarely named the crimes. To admit too much was to expose the collusion of silence that had allowed it to fester. By 1839, rumors circulated of Fenwick's return, not to Georgia, but to Louisiana. There, he was said to offer restorative elixirs to planters weary of fever and weakness. None could prove it was the same man, yet stories of sudden deaths, of households ruined by his prescriptions, shadowed the Mississippi Delta for decades. The scholars who traced him called it migration of the poison, a pattern repeating. Meanwhile, Eliza remained in Milledgeville. Nurses described her as calm, polite, ceaselessly writing. Visitors reported that she greeted them with rational discourse, only to drift into descriptions of marrow and memory. One nurse recorded her words in 1844, "Do you not see, the body is but clay and marrow the ink? With it one can write again what has faded. The children were my first attempt. They were the parchment. I was the scribe. The work will continue even when I am gone." Her death in 1852 did not silence those words. By the time the Civil War came, the Holloway estate was already fractured. Freedmen spoke of the creek as cursed. White neighbors avoided its bend. Yet Catherine maintained the property until her death in 1899, always forbidding the land by the creek to be touched. She never explained why. When asked in her final days, she simply whispered, "It remembers." The medical community filed the Holloway case under insanity. Historians later reframed it as pseudoscience, but those who lived near Turkey Creek called it by another name, the marrow ledger. Not a sickness, not a theory, but a ledger of cruelty, written line by line in bodies. And, like all ledgers, it waits for balance. Testimony and Ashes 1839-1846. When Eliza Holloway was taken to Milledgeville, the immediate crisis at Holloway Estate seemed, at least outwardly, contained. The children were in Catherine's care. The dawn rituals ceased. The creek grew silent, but silence is not the same as resolution. The county probate court convened in late 1839 to decide the fate of the estate and its heirs. Catherine Vance was named temporary guardian. Yet disputes arose almost immediately. Local creditors, planters and merchants who had loaned Thomas Holloway money before his death, filed claims. Among them was attorney Howard Pritchard, who had quietly profited from arranging Holloway's debts. His argument was cunning, that Eliza's confinement made her incapable of protecting her property, and therefore the estate should be placed under the permanent guidance of a professional custodian. Catherine fought this with vigor. She presented medical affidavits, letters, and even Eliza's own journals as proof not only of her madness, but of the danger of allowing opportunists like Pritchard to take control. "My duty is to protect the children," she wrote in a petition, "and to ensure that their legacy is not swallowed by vultures who thrive on madness." The court sided with Catherine, for the time. Pritchard was denied guardianship, but he lingered at the margins watching. His name appeared again years later in records tied to other estates stripped by legal oversight. Meanwhile, the enslaved community bore the deepest scars. Oral testimony gathered after the Civil War gives glimpses into their suffering. One account from an elderly man named Josiah, likely a relative of one of the subjects, describes the aftermath. "We did not go near the bend, not after what she done. The trees were wrong there, the birds wouldn't sing. When the young ones tried to fetch water, we pulled them back. 'Don't touch it,' we said. It remembers." Even those who had never seen Eliza's rituals spoke of the place as cursed. By 1840, Turkey Creek's bend was avoided entirely, a void in the landscape. In Charleston, whispers of the Holloway scandal circulated among physicians and lawyers. Morton published an article under a pseudonym in 1841 in a regional medical journal, carefully avoiding names but describing a woman of standing who sought renewal by transfusion of essence from the enslaved. Most readers dismissed it as Gothic exaggeration. A handful, however, recognized it for what it was, a record of Eliza's crimes disguised as case study. Victor Fenwick's shadow loomed in these discussions. Rumors placed him in Havana, in New Orleans, even as far south as Veracruz. His methods were always the same: bottles of vitalizing elixirs, promises of renewed youth, sudden decline of patience. Morton tracked these accounts with a grim obsession. In his letters he wrote, "The man has carried his poison wherever there are desperate souls. He preys upon the old, the childless, the barren, the sickly. He cloaks himself as savior and leaves ruin. His ghost haunts every ledger I open." Yet Fenwick was never captured, and his name faded from directories by the mid-1840s. Like Eliza, he became more legend than man. Back in Georgia, Catherine struggled to hold the Holloway family together. By 1842, Sarah Holloway, Eliza's eldest daughter, had grown restless. In a letter to her brother Thomas, then studying in Virginia, she wrote, "They whisper in Charleston that mother was a witch. Here in Georgia they whisper worse, that she was a murderer. I cannot escape her shadow. Every time I look into the mirror I see her eyes. They do not let me forget." Sarah married a physician from Philadelphia later that year, leaving Georgia behind forever. Thomas, determined to escape as well, sold his eventual share of Holloway estate in 1856, erasing his connection to the land. The younger siblings were told carefully edited versions of the truth. They knew their mother had gone mad. They did not know the Marrow ledger, yet fragments of Eliza's writings refused to vanish. In 1844, Catherine found one of Eliza's journals hidden in a false drawer. She read only a few pages before burning it in the hearth, but one entry stayed with her until her death. It read, "I see now what I did not before. It is not strength alone that passes through marrow, it is memory. Each draught taken, each drop exchanged, carries something more than flesh. I have not only borrowed their strength, I have borrowed their sorrow." Catherine never spoke of it publicly, but she confided in her diary that this was the most terrible sentence I have ever read. The legal system never addressed the deaths of Isaiah, Jonah, or Caleb. Under Georgia law, as Catherine bitterly noted, the killing of enslaved people by their owner or mistress was not murder but destruction of property. To press charges would have meant acknowledging the enslaved as persons. No such acknowledgement came. Instead, the Holloway scandal became a family matter, confined to probate courts and whispered tales. The records were sealed. What remained was rumor, heavy with superstition. By 1850, neighbors told stories of the Lady of the Creek, whose shadow could still be seen at dawn among the cypress trees. Children were warned not to linger by the bend, lest she call them into the water. In 1846, Catherine received a letter from Eliza herself, smuggled from the asylum. It was the only surviving piece of Eliza's voice outside her journals, and it chilled Catherine to the bone. "I see clearly now. They call it madness, but it is clarity. I took from them, yes, but I gave as well. I gave them place in me. They live where I live. If they call me murderer, then so be it. I am ledger and scribe. I do not repent." Catherine never replied. She sealed the letter in a trunk, where it remained until her death. After Eliza's passing in 1852, the asylum staff noted only, "Patient expired of pneumonia, remains calm to end." Yet one nurse left an additional note, hidden among her effects. She died with a smile, whispering of water, of children, of marrow. She said she was already written into others, and so she could not truly die. Those words spread among the attendants, who repeated them for years afterward. By mid-century, the Holloway estate was fractured. The land was parceled, the house left in decline, but the story, the Marrow ledger, remained, carried by whispers in Burke County, hidden in court transcripts, smoldering in Catherine's letters. It had become more than scandal, more than crime. It was myth now, a story to frighten children, yes, but also a shadow to haunt descendants, a reminder of how grief, desperation, and cruelty could twist into science, and how science could twist into horror. The creek that remembers 1865-1870. When the war ended in 1865, Georgia's soil was raw with ash and blood. The Holloway estate lay in ruins, its house long abandoned, the fields overgrown with briar. Soldiers had passed through during Sherman's march, stripping timbers for fuel, leaving the shell of the mansion like a blackened ribcage against the sky. For the first time in their lives, the men and women once bound to Holloway names stood free. Yet freedom did not erase memory. If anything, it sharpened it. With the planter class scattered or broken, voices long silenced began to speak. The Freedmen's Bureau collected testimony from the region in 1866. Among the depositions is a brief but chilling account attributed to J.H., aged about 70, formerly enslaved by the Holloways. Historians identify this man as Josiah, who had once spoken of avoiding the creek bend. Now, without the gag of slavery, he elaborated, "Mistress Eliza, she take our strongest boys, the ones that could lift and run. She give them potions and cut them at the bend. Said it was to cure her, but they come back weak or not at all. We buried 'em quiet when we could. Sometimes we was not allowed, then the earth took him without marker." This deposition was filed among countless others describing beatings, whippings, starvation, yet the Holloway testimony stood out, eerily clinical in its details of blood, marrow, and ritual. Many northern clerks dismissed it as superstition, the confused memory of an old man, but among freedmen the story held weight. As Reconstruction unfolded, Turkey Creek became a place of whispered pilgrimage. Formerly, enslaved families avoided building homes near the bend. Hunters told of strange silences in the cypress grove, of hounds whining and refusing to cross the ridge. Children were warned, "Don't drink there, don't swim there, the water carries memory." By the 1870s, a phrase had taken hold in Burke County, "the creek that remembers." It appeared in fireside stories, in the songs of field hands, even in sermons where preachers warned against the devil's science. The creek, they said, had drunk too deeply of blood and would not forget. Catherine Vance did not live to hear this folklore. She died in 1868, her papers locked in a trunk later found by her nieces. But her diary reveals that even she, rational and cautious, sensed something unearthly in Eliza's experiments. One entry from 1847 reads, "It is not the cruelty alone that chills me, it is the residue. I have seen animals shy from the creek. I have seen the children fall ill when they drink of it. I fear the ground itself has taken her madness." That diary, discovered after the war, was read aloud in hushed tones by Catherine's relatives. Each time the story shifted slightly. Eliza became a witch, the experiments a pact, the ledger a grimoire. The truth decayed into legend, but legend, unlike fact, could not be buried. Visitors to the ruins recorded their impressions. In 1872, a Union veteran named Silas Hooper, traveling through Georgia to collect war stories, stopped at the Holloway estate. His journal notes, "The house is a carcass. The locals avoid it. They tell me the mistress was mad, that she drank the life of her own slaves. They say the water runs red some mornings. I camped near the creek, but found I could not sleep. The frogs stilled at midnight. Something moved in cypress, but no wind stirred the branches." Hooper's account, later published in a small veterans newspaper, introduced the Holloway horror to readers far beyond Georgia. Northerners consumed it as macabre entertainment, the grotesque excess of a slaveholding South devouring itself. To the locals, however, it was no entertainment. It was inheritance. Among the freedmen, the Holloway story carried moral weight. It became a parable against vanity and cruelty, a warning of how unchecked power corroded the soul. Elders told children, "Miss Eliza thought she could take the strength of others, but sorrow is stronger than strength. It drowned her in the end." And yet, beneath the moral, the supernatural lingered. In one tale collected in 1875 by a traveling folklorist, Eliza's ghost was said to walk the creek at dawn, bending low as though drinking from the water. In another, the cries of Isaiah and Jonah could be heard in the wind, calling for the marrow that was taken. Such stories blurred history with myth, but for those who had lived through the Holloway years, they needed no ghosts. The memory itself was haunting enough. Meanwhile, descendants of the Holloway children scattered across the states. Sarah, living in Philadelphia, never spoke her mother's name again. Thomas sold his share of the estate and joined a mercantile company in Richmond. Only the youngest, Catherine's wards, remained in Georgia, where whispers followed them in schoolyards and church pews. Witches' blood, some called them. They grew up under a legacy they could neither escape nor fully understand. The Holloway ruin itself remained untouched. Farmers reclaimed the surrounding land, but none would clear the house. It stood, roof sagging, windows blackened, its chimney pointing skyward like a gravestone. Nature claimed it year by year, yet no one dared tear it down. By 1878, the Holloway legend had become regional folklore, a ghost story told alongside tales of haints and swamp witches. It circulated in both white and black communities, though with different emphases. Whites spoke of madness and scandal, blacks of vengeance and memory. Both agreed on one thing: the creek remembered. The phrase carried beyond Georgia. In a volume of Southern folklore published in 1881, the Holloway story appeared as The Lady of the Creek. The author, an amateur folklorist from Savannah, described it thus: "She bathed in blood, she drank of marrow, she sought to live forever. Now the waters whisper her name, and no bird will sing in her grove." The folklorist stripped away the legal records, the asylum letters, the marrow ledger, leaving only myth. Yet in doing so, he ensured that Eliza Holloway's crimes would never entirely vanish. By the end of the Reconstruction era, Holloway's name had dissolved into shadow. The estate was broken, the family scattered, the house in ruins, but the legend lived on, stitched into Georgia's haunted geography. To some, it was a ghost story, to others, a record of atrocity half buried in myth. The creek itself, dark and winding, bore no plaque, no marker. But those who lived near it knew its name, whispered on windless nights: the creek that remembers. The ledger in the trunk 1880-1925. By the turn of the century, the Holloway estate was a ruin swallowed by pine and kudzu. Children of Burke County, both black and white, grew up daring one another to step across its sagging porch, to touch the rotted doorframe, to peer into the cellar where roots hung like nooses. Few lingered long. The silence had weight there. The phrase, "the creek that remembers," endured. It passed from fireside to schoolyard, from sermons to whispered jokes at dusk. Yet the farther time carried the Holloways, the more the tale bent under the pressure of imagination. In one telling, Eliza Holloway was a witch who bargained with a swamp demon. In another, she was a vampire feeding on the blood of enslaved men. A third claimed she had bottled their marrow in glass jars, buried beneath the cypress roots. Behind the superstitions, though, lay the stubborn residue of truth: the diary of Catherine Vance, the testimony of Friedman, the reports of Dr. Alcott. These papers had been boxed, scattered, misplaced in courthouses and attics. Some lay forgotten in the bottom drawers of law offices. Others, folded into family trunks, gathered dust among yellowed letters and broken spectacles. The Holloway history was not erased, only buried, waiting for hands to lift the lid. In 1892, one such lid opened. A local boy named Daniel Worth, rummaging through his grandfather's attic in Augusta, discovered a trunk filled with papers tied in twine. Among them lay brittle sheets in Catherine Vance's handwriting. He showed them to his teacher, who brought them to the attention of a Savannah newspaper. That winter, the Savannah Evening Herald ran a 3-part article entitled "The Holloway Madness, Georgia's Forgotten Case of Blood and Marrow." The articles mixed fact and folklore. They printed excerpts of Catherine's diary, describing Eliza's obsession with the purification of the body through sacrifice. They quoted Josiah's deposition, his words bent into Gothic prose by the reporter. They even referenced the destroyed ledger, though none had ever seen it. The series spread beyond Georgia. Northern papers reprinted the tale under headlines like "A Vampire Mistress of the South" and "The Marrow Experiments of Burke County." Readers devoured it as lurid curiosity. For locals, however, the effect was colder. Descendants of Holloways, living quietly under new names in Savannah and Charleston, found themselves shunned. Witches' kin, and neighbors whispered. One Savannah woman, Elizabeth Green, wrote to the paper in protest. She claimed to be Eliza Holloway's granddaughter and denied the accusations as slander. But the paper printed her letter beside a mocking editorial, suggesting denial only confirmed the curse. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Holloway story had become a Southern Gothic staple. Folklorists and novelists alike drew from it. In 1904, a pulp writer named Jonas W. Lake published The Lady of the Marrow, a sensational novel clearly inspired by Eliza. It told of a plantation mistress who bled her slaves dry in the name of immortality. The book sold modestly but cemented the Holloway figure in American Gothic literature. The truth, however, continued to surface in quieter, darker ways. In 1911, courthouse renovations in Augusta unearthed a packet of legal correspondence from the 1840s. Inside were fragments of Dr. Alcott's reports, his precise notes on lesions, weakened marrow, ritual incisions at the femur. The papers were nearly discarded until a clerk, curious about their strangeness, preserved them in a file labeled Unusual Testimony, 1847. That same year, a traveling preacher in Burke County preached a sermon against the hollow ways of sin, a play on the Holloway name. He warned his congregation that sins unrepented stain the earth, and the earth remembers. Parishioners swore he had heard voices in the night at Turkey Creek. Folklore swelled in parallel with half-buried fact. One tale from 1918 told of a farmer's mule that balked at the creek crossing, refusing to move until dawn. Another told of boys who carved their initials into the Holloway ruin, only to die of fever weeks later. In 1921, a WPA folklorist named Maynard Bishop recorded these tales for the Georgia Writers Project. His notes preserve some of the most chilling variants. Mistress Holloway take their strength, put it in her own bones. She said God give her the right. Now she walk at night with her bones showing white. If you go to the creek when it quiet, you can hear her teeth grinding the marrow still. For Bishop, these stories were evidence of Southern superstition, a colorful addition to his archive. For those who told them, they were warning memory, inheritance. Meanwhile, in the Holloway family itself, silence calcified into secrecy. Sarah's descendants in Philadelphia refused to acknowledge their Georgia roots. Thomas's line in Richmond carried the name but kept no portraits, no letters. Only distant cousins in Burke County bore the weight of whispered rumor, finding doors closed to them in school and church. By 1925, the Holloway ruin was more skeleton than house. Walls had collapsed, ivy choked the chimneys, local boys scavenged bricks for their own hearths, yet the cellar mouth remained dark and yawning. Some swore that at dusk, if one leaned too close, a smell lingered, metallic, sweet, faint as memory. That year, an Augusta journalist revisited the legend. His article, The Holloway Curse After 80 Years, speculated that the creek itself had been poisoned by arsenic or other chemicals used in Eliza's experiments. He quoted old freedmen who insisted the water made children sick. He ended his article with a rhetorical question: what madness leaves its stain not only on bloodlines, but on the very soil? It was never answered. Thus, by the 1920s, the Holloway name had shifted fully into a liminal state, part history, part folklore, part whispered warning. The legal documents existed, scattered in archives and attics. The diaries and depositions remained, fragile as moth wings. But to most who spoke of the Holloways, the past had already transformed into myth. And yet, beneath the vines and ruin, beneath the sermons and ghost tales, something stubborn endured. A ledger once burned still left its shadow. A creek, once drunk, still carried its memory. The Holloways were gone. But the soil, the water, the silence, they remembered. The water never forgets 1930s present. By the 1930s, the Holloway ruin was no more. Timber scavengers tore down what remained, carting bricks and beams away for barns and smokehouses. The cellar was filled in with earth. The fields were cleared for cotton once again. On the surface, it seemed the past had been erased, but absence does not erase memory, it deepens it. Folklorists of the Depression years collected fragments of the Holloway story, now worn thin with repetition. Eliza became a shadow figure, less woman than archetype, a witch, a ghoul, a ghost walking the Cypress Bend, yet buried in county archives, Catherine's diary and Dr. Alcott's letters remained brittle proof that the horror had been flesh and blood, not only smoke and tail. The creek itself remained unchanged. Hunters still reported their hounds refusing the crossing. Fishermen spoke of bream with strange lesions, bones brittle in the hand. Children dared one another to drink from the bend. Most spat the water out, claiming it tasted of iron. In the 1950s, a team of surveyors mapping rural waterways paused at Turkey Creek. Their field notes remark casually, "Local residents report the water bad luck. Some say it turns stomachs, refused to camp near the cypress stand, atmosphere heavy." The scientists tested nothing, filed their maps, and moved on, but locals did not move on. A farmer in 1962 claimed his well had soured after digging too close to the creek. A boy in 1974 drowned in its waters. Though called an accident, older residents shook their heads. "The creek don't let go," they said. By the late 20th century, the Holloway story found a new home, the internet. Early message boards and folklore forums carried rumors of the creek that remembers. Posters spoke of ghosts seen on the waterline, of bones surfacing after floods. One claimed his grandfather had unearthed a glass jar near the bend. Inside, a dark residue he swore was blood. The jar, he said, shattered the night it was found. Others dismissed the tale as rural legend, another southern Gothic embellishment. But scattered archival finds kept surfacing, stubborn as weeds. A graduate student in 1987, researching Reconstruction records, uncovered Josiah's deposition in a bureau file. A historian in 1993 cited Catherine's diary in a footnote on Southern madness. Each discovery pulled the story back toward fact, even as folklore ran ahead. In 2001, after heavy rains, erosion exposed the edge of what had once been the Holloway cellar. Local workers clearing debris reported finding fragments of bone among the churned mud. The county quietly dismissed the find as animal remains. Yet one photograph, grainy and blurred, circulated online. A femur too long for livestock, pitted with unnatural marks. The whispers grew louder. Paranormal investigators began visiting Turkey Creek. They brought cameras, recorders, EMF meters. Their videos, posted to early YouTube, showed little beyond static and silence. Yet each ended with the same phrase spoken by locals, reluctant but firm: "The water remembers." Today, the Holloway name has almost vanished. Families who bear it do not speak of Eliza. Graves are left untended. Portraits gather dust in attics. Yet the story endures, stitched into Georgia's haunted geography. Stand by Turkey Creek at dawn, locals say, and you may see her, a pale woman bending low as if to drink. Some claim she lingers at the waterline, her reflection rippling independent of the body above. Others swear the cries of men echo faintly at night, carried on no wind. In county libraries, fragments of her history wait in folders no one opens. Catherine's diary, brittle and brown. Alcott's reports, clinical and cold. Josiah's words, plain and heavy. Together, they form a shadowed archive of atrocity, one that scholarship has only begun to touch. But the land itself remains the strongest witness. The cypress bend still stands. The earth still yields bone after storms. The creek still tastes faintly of iron. It would be easier to dismiss it all as folklore, as superstition grown over the bones of history. Yet those who live nearby will tell you the same thing as their parents told them and their parents before. The water never forgets. And if water remembers, then so too does the soil and the air and the blood that runs quietly in the veins of those who carry Holloway kin. Some names may have changed, but the marrow does not. If you are ever in Burke County, do not drink from the creek at the bend. Do not linger by the cypress when the frogs fall silent. Do not speak her name aloud after dark. Because the Holloways are gone, but the water remembers.